Chris and Rob, welcome to the TechBurst Talks podcast.
Charles, it's great to be back with you and especially to be with Rob as well.
Fantastic. Thanks for having us, Charles. Great to see you again, Chris, and great to be here for this international episode.
It's funny, we could have actually done this years ago in Chiswick because we were all living within a few blocks of each other, but now I'm sitting in Singapore. Chris is in Chiswick, and where are you now?
I'm in Canada right now, Western Canada.
Western Canada. So yes, so you're enjoying the heat there. I got the heat here, and then Chris has a little bit of sunshine in London, which is a nice change.
Beautiful.
Chris, can you tell us a little bit about yourself and your business and what role you play in the global telecoms industry?
Of course, Charles. So I've been working as an industry analyst, a telecom industry analyst for 40 years now. The last 11 years as an independent, having worked with some of the big names in the research houses. So I work with the big players on the vendor side and on the telco side, trying to make sense of all of the dynamics at play in the market. So trying to understand that balance of demand and supply, the relative role of telcos, and the role that vendors play in helping telcos fulfill that role. And I also do a lot of work now around accessibility and inclusive design in terms of how do we design the technology so everybody can use it equitably. So whether they might have any sort of impairment, they might not be able to afford the most expensive service. So that accessibility inclusion is another area that I find really interesting that actually could expand the size of the market.
Rob, how about you?
Oh, thanks, Charles. So I've been in and around the industry for 35 years on a fairly international basis, just like we're international on this call today. Spent a lot of that in North America, Europe, and Asia Pacific. Done a lot of things in the ecosystem on many sides of the equation. So I've worked vendor side, I've done C-level roles within operator. I've worked with product providers, IoT service providers. And a lot of what I do now in running my business is working on large transformation programs, building and fixing things in the industry, very service development focused and go-to-market focused, and doing some of the things that we talked about today in that service environment, bringing some customer focus into it and actually building solutions and taking them to market.
So what we're going to talk about today is telco and find out what is the latest trends, how are things going, is the industry actually moving forward? But why don't we start off, Chris, why don't you start off with this? Like, what are the top trends, the most significant ones you see right now impacting the global telecoms industry?
Well, as an analyst looking at the global telecom market, I'm always trying to see how the balance of demand and supply look. I think in the past we've had a massive oversupply or overemphasis on the supply and not enough focus on the demand and what people actually do with the services that we sell. So in that sense, I think we are getting closer to an equilibrium where the broadband provided both through fixed networks and mobile, and with a little bit of satellite thrown in for good measure, actually addresses the vast majority of need. And what we see is that the regulatory environment is shaping the way different country markets are in particular in how they allow price levels to fluctuate or whether they just allow competition to drive down. So the key trend is that demand has never been greater. We want to connect ourselves more regularly. Obviously, we're individually on the go, households, office environments. We want to connect all those things that we've talked about in IoT. But actually, the way that we drive the economics of the industry, we haven't been able to command a higher price for those things because supply is so high. So we do face an issue in the industry where we fundamentally have to reduce the cost of delivering all of those connections while still maintaining, if not increasing, the quality of the connection in order to keep the customers happy. And by the way, the customers, of course, are not just us as individuals and us as businesses, but there's a whole channel structure behind it, which telecoms used to be this lovely self-contained industry that dictated the rules of the game and told you how much it was going to cost you to do it. Increasingly today, and I'm sure we'll come on to this a lot more later, it's really about telco finding its position in that broader ecosystem and finding its role in there and not dictating and dominating as it thought it would do in the past.
Rob, do you have some thoughts on this as well?
Yeah, I'd like to build on that a little bit. And I think Chris made some really good points about how the industry is evolving. And I think it does that, supply demand curve needs to shift. And I think everyone agrees it needs to. It needs to be more customer centric. It needs to be more revenue driven as well as, managing the cost side. I think there's been a lot of things that have been happening to help manage the cost side, use of cloud, virtualization, things like that. But as we've gotten into a lot of the spend and the supply buildup all around things like 5G, It's been a lot of, as it has been in this industry in many cases, build it and they will come. So I think we need to have this shift that becomes more customer centric. I think it's starting to happen. I think it's also a recognition that there needs to be more focus on enterprise because consumer is not where the massive growth will potentially come from. And I think, couldn't talk about trends without mentioning AI. And I know AI is overhyped, overbuzzed. We'll dive into that a lot, I'm sure, during this session. But I do think it has a lot of potential for transforming the industry. Maybe not in some of the more sexy use cases that everyone likes to talk about, but even in smaller and really, really important use cases like fraud management and that sort of consumer protection things. AI is quite important. And Chris also mentioned that, satellites coming into this. There's a word in the industry we've used a lot for probably decades, which is convergence. And I think we're also now seeing that convergence on the bearer types, on the network types between IT and telecoms. Everything is over a broadband connection. And we're also seeing convergence of services that, there aren't telco services versus broadband services versus other services. It's all sort of coming together and being delivered over these converged networks. So very interesting times. Lots of things happening to grow and new opportunities. But I think there's a lot of things in the industry that we need to be honest about and be better at addressing to take advantage of some of those new trends.
What I've been looking at a lot is data and like the regs that it's plummeting. The prices are plummeting. No matter you look at it from the consumer rates or what you're seeing for enterprise or even IoT and even LeoSat connectivity is coming down quite a bit as well. I just switched packages recently and I was paying 80 Singapore dollars a month to have 5 gig. I pay $15 a month and I've got 150 gig. So that I think is an interesting trend. And yet last week, I just saw an announcement from Telstra. They're actually increasing their mobile rates. It's like a very different environment down there where Australia has always been one of the most expensive ones. So what are you seeing on the pricing in Europe? I mean, are they still coming down? Is data pricing coming down and making it more affordable? But if they're doing that, where are the operators going to make the money to actually pay for all those investments they had in 5G?
Well, that's part of the problem for the industry, isn't it? It is oversupply. The fact of the matter is, under the monopoly regime 40 plus years ago, you could charge whatever you like. As we move into a more competitive environment, and Europe is the most competitive. Actually, no, probably India might be the most competitive. But in terms of what we pay for it, prices will keep coming down because if a telco puts its prices up, the ability to move to a very similar service, at a lower price is there because people are looking for market share. What happened in quite a few places was that people had a price mechanism worked out with the regulator where it was inflation plus a certain amount. And so when inflation was high a couple of years ago, then they've whacked the prices up. And I think that's part of Telstra's view as well is, they need to increase prices in order to get the funding in to put all that capital investment that Rob was talking about earlier. Now, the problem then is that it will make people move and migrate to, or churn, as we call it in the mobile industry. Although, of course, what most telcos play on is the fact that the inertia is quite significant. People don't really want to change. The interaction that the telcos have with their customers are relatively infrequent. And therefore, we're not making a purchase by purchase choice like we are when we buy something from Amazon or one of the online services. So it's sort of a background purchase that we deal with every now and again. But fundamentally in Europe, because of European regulation, we have too many players chasing a pretty static market. The market is not growing. And to Rob's point earlier, 70% roughly is consumer, 20% business, and 10% other for the industry. So if that consumer bit shrinks by any significant proportion, to make up for that by selling business services in the enterprise market is a real challenge because margins on business services used to be much higher, but now they're getting squeezed because of other players being able to offer those services. So I often picture it as a pie chart with, and the French call it a camembert, Charles. You're an educated man. So they call it a camembert when they have the little pie. And I often picture it with little mice around the edge nibbling away at the pie because all the people that Rob mentioned, the hyperscalers, the device guys, the software players, they're all providing services which nibble away because the core of the market is fundamentally broadband. And the expensive services we used to have are really becoming less and less relevant in the B2C and B2B market they are very relevant in the B2B2C market, that middle ground, that sort of emerging environment. But yeah, pressures are on. And North America, very much, they've managed to maintain very high ARPUs or relatively high ARPU because actually, despite all the competition, they pretty much, the US has got three major players, and people just pay higher prices. Japan's still pretty high. Asia's generally pretty low. And obviously India, the fact that India can survive on a couple of dollar ARPU, but they're trying to push it up, by the way. So people like Geo desperately trying to push their ARPU up and get more out of people.
They're trying, but that's some of the challenges they face. I think this is a good time to
Yeah.
segue into that. In this competitive environment where there is this mismatch between supply and demand, there's just too much supply. How are they going to get over this? Like, what are the biggest challenges facing these telecom operators today? Rob, what do you think?
Yeah, so it's a very good question, and I think there's a couple approaches to it. One is the classic approach, which is a little bit of arbitrage and a little bit of smoke and mirrors, a bit of a shell game of your tariff package about, what do you get for minutes, text, and data? And as you said earlier, Charles, like, oh yeah, let's give you 1,000 gigabytes of data, knowing that you're not going to use it. So it's basically, the standard smoke and mirrors game, or it's moving things around and charging you more on roaming or charging for add-ons. And it's really interesting perspective for me because I currently have 3 different tariff packages, one in Asia, one in North America, and one in Europe. So I can see how they do some of these things differently. Chris mentioned the price is still quite high in North America. My UK SIM, which has roaming included on it, it's actually cheaper to use my roaming data, my SIM per gigabyte than it is to have a local package in North America. It's ridiculous, right? And some of that's driven out of the competition that Chris mentioned on the roaming side, the regulatory environment in Europe. And then, there's also things like, it drives me crazy in Asia, right? Where you have to pay for caller ID and voicemail and everything. So it starts with a low base package and then all these little add-ons that they charge and charge and charge for what really aren't high value services. So that's that traditional piece. And roaming, look, since COVID, roaming's gone backwards as a market, right? It's become more expensive. There's a lot of people that have put up tariffs and they're trying to claw back money. That's just the industry spinning its wheels, doing its cycles. But then, Chris mentioned Geo, and Geo, I think, is a good example of looking at, well, how do we actually build new revenue streams? How do we build, some sticky value with customers around? And I think from a consumer point of view, it's things like loyalty, it's things like payments, it's e-commerce, it's building an ecosystem and building more value around it. And this is something that the industry has talked about for decades and has been very bad at doing. But I think that's how, on the consumer side to generate true value. And then I think on the enterprise side, again, it's going beyond connectivity, but it's slightly different piece on that, which is, solving operational problems within an enterprise. So talk about IoT, you talk about industry, you said it's 5.0. I don't know who chooses when it goes from 4.0 to 5.0 or whether there was an industry 4.1 or 2. Anyway, as you go through that and transforming industry, I do think there's a lot of opportunities to monetize. But again, it's getting out of that traditional connectivity provider and just shuffling around what you get in your connectivity.
But there's also an issue here, isn't there, with the connectivity used to be a service you bought on its own. And there was scarcity of supply and therefore prices went up. There is no scarcity of supply now, but also more importantly, connectivity is part of a whole range of other things that we use as consumers or as businesses. And if you go back to your comment, Rob, about the hyperscalers and the cloud guys and all those people, at any point within an enterprise environment and arguably within the consumer environment as well, you need a combination of connectivity, analytics, security, storage, compute, applications, device, all these things, which can be managed by the telco, but can equally, since they're digital building blocks, can be managed by anyone else in the ecosystem. And the other thing which I think people are not often conscious of is, Apple has built massive ecosystem of its own, which commands and controls a lot of payment, a lot of activity, a lot of service consumption. Salesforce has done the same. Cisco has done the same, right? So I think there are many other players who are building up capabilities in all areas that it's quite difficult for telco to adjust its position and its culture and its mentality to be able to address all those issues.
Are they able to really differentiate against them? Because I mean, if you're looking at those big hyperscalers or the big ICT brands, how are the telcos really going to compete? Because where they're really good is on the connectivity, and that's a revenue stream that's not going to be growing unless you just add that much more connectivity. Your
And,
rates
and
aren't going to be going up.
that's local, Charles, right? So
Yeah.
that's a local. So connectivity is a local issue because we don't really build the global networks the way we used to. Um, but all of the IT stuff is from a global industry where they get massive, much greater economies of scale. And that's part of the fundamental equation for the telecom industry is how do we make enough money to keep feeding this beast, which is demanding more and more bandwidth because we're consuming more bandwidth because you've just been offered 250 gig, which you don't need. So I think that there's some real fundamental errors in the way we position the services. To Rob's point earlier, if you're creating value for me as a customer, then that needs to be around supporting my business, supporting my lifestyle. I don't need to be given 250 gig because like you, I'm probably using 5 gig a month. So I think we probably do face a bit of an adjustment in terms of the way services are packaged and sold to us and personalized and customized around our requirements. And that's what we've not been very good at. We've basically stacked them high and sold them not so cheap, but we've stacked them high and sold them in the past.
But the telcos have tried to do this. They've been going on this path for the last, 15 years. I mean, when I was at Vodafone, we had 600 people in professional services as a mobile SI, basically adding different types of things on. I mean, then Vodafone out and acquired cable and wireless. Everyone's been branching out to try and build in that business, but they've made a bit out of it, but none of them have been as successful probably as they would have liked to have been in it. I mean, are you seeing anyone out there who's really doing it right today?
Go on, Rob, you're not spoken for a while.
Yeah, sure. So
Great.
look, I
Hand
think
him that poison chalice. Yeah.
yeah, Chris, you just have the easy questions. I'll take the tough ones. Okay.
Hospital pass, yeah.
Yeah. So look, I think, what Chris raised a really good point, right? Because when you look at what's happening in the industry, like the service used to be the connectivity and the broadband and the network. That's no longer the service. It's just an enabler. And I don't know. Do I get kicked off the podcast if I use the dumb bit pie thing that everyone tries to avoid talking about? I mean, in some ways, that's kind of what's happened. So, but there are people doing, and it is possible, I think, to move up that value chain. As Chris mentioned, Apple's, the Googles, the hyperscalers. There's lots of people that are building an ecosystem that are tying it in with more value-added services, software. So it's not like it's an impossible feat. So I don't think that the industry has been particularly great at it. But what we also see is, especially when you come to, IoT and the industrial side of it, I know this is an area that you guys both know very, very well. And a lot of companies that are very successful in that are people that spin out from the big operators, right? So people, you mentioned Gerhard earlier, the guys at Caliper, guys at Wireless Logic or Core Wireless. Some of these guys are guys that come from the big operators, and they actually take the enabling factor, the connectivity, they bundle that together with some technology enablers like multi-IMSI and that sort of capability, and they provide connectivity, but not just connectivity. They solve problems, whether it's, water leak detection or it's fleet management or it's supply chain management. I mean, again, it's about going up the value chain and bundling that. So there are examples, as Chris mentioned, in big tech. There's are examples in telco, but what I think we've seen more of is more of that innovation coming out of telco into smaller companies, because I think we have a challenge in the big telcos moving away from the traditional models. And so it's faster to do it in smaller companies. And we're seeing some innovation, but I think there's much more to go, particularly as 5G comes in and AI comes into that whole industrial environment.
What I would say about that, I think the comment about telcos, like people leaving telcos and doing innovative things, is an interesting concept, because I think that sometimes when you're in that telco, it can be tough. I've worked for three of the biggest ones in the world, and it's bureaucratic, it's slow. So then the idea is you go somewhere that's more small, nimble, and agile, and you can actually develop and deploy and have impact quickly. But
Yep.
also what it means is when you're in a telco, you're limited to pushing your connectivity. And that means you can't always give the best solution to the customer. And this goes back to the whole debate before when we had LoRa, Sigfox, and NB-IoT. And it was like, mine's better than yours. Well, actually, depending on the use case, each one could be appropriate. but
Yep.
because I'm a telco, I can only push this. Whereas I used to tell Telstra, I was doing one of their sales kickoffs and I got asked a question about, well, what would you do if you were us? And I'm like, I would launch LoRa tomorrow. You don't have to do anything. You've already got your professional services team. That helps you compete against all those other players. And you can do it if the customer needs it. And if they don't, it's no big deal. I mean, you can just deliver this stuff as required, but it basically gets you into more bids instead of trying to talk people out of what they really want to use. So I think like the telcos, like they've faced this pressure from, the competitors like LoRa when it came in and then Sigfox for a while. I'm not sure what's going on with them anymore, but now they have satellite coming in. And satellite's creeping into the consumer space and doing very well. I mean, I was down in South America for a few months. Everywhere there is using it. Gerhard, who you just mentioned, I was on a call with him last week, and he was literally doing it off of Starlink because the Telstra coverage where he lives is crap. I guess that's the proper word for
Yeah.
it. That's a scientific term, I think. It's crap. So that's coming in. Now, when that actually goes into the enterprise side as well, it gets very interesting. So, I mean, I just think that the telcos they're facing a lot of different challenges from a lot of different sides right now.
But it's also this issue which has been around for years and years and years. We focus in telecoms about, oh, it's got to be 5 nines, it's got to be the best, it's got to be the latest. Actually, fit for purpose was always when I was at Logic, was the software fit for purpose? Yes, it does the job. So I think in many ways, the network, the connectivity is over spec for what most people use. And obviously, if you're in a remote area with no connection, you can only have satellite. You're going to have it. Satellite is not as good as a fixed fiber. It's not as good as 5G 7, but it'll do a job. And the fact that people, we've always adapted around what was available to us as connectivity. And I think we have this sort of strange view in telecoms that it's got to be the absolute Rolls Royce of connectivity. Well, it doesn't. It can be a Trabant. I don't even know if Trabant still exists. It can be a very basic car because it's transport, right? It's getting you, it's connecting, it's getting you there. By the way, I think satellite's overblown in its importance. It's not. I'm glad it's come around. I'm glad it's making another appearance, but it's one of those things that it's filling in a niche gap in the market. I don't believe it'll be mainstream.
I think it'll depend on the parts of the world. Because this, again, if you look at it globally, I agree with you. But I think what I've seen, like in New Zealand, in Australia, in South
Sure.
America, people are using it because it's the best way to get connectivity to remote areas. And there's a lot
It's
of
filling
remote
in
areas.
exactly, but
Yeah.
you just answered the question. It's a remote area thing. It's not.
Yeah. But a lot of the world is remote.
A lot of the world is remote. Well, 3 billion of the world population not even connected yet. So there's a hell of a chunk of people to get connected. Unfortunately, they can't afford the connection and the devices and so on. But
Mm.
if you look at the structure of the industry, what happens, and this is another thing you need to look at on a country by country basis, any region, the amount of money going into fiber, building fiber into the ground, the long-term return on that is great. It's much more like a utility return. To get back to your not so dumb pipes, but actually lucrative pipe or an investment. So we face the challenge that there are plenty of means of connecting. If you're in a big conurbation, you probably use fiber because it gives you the best value. You might be a mobile only household, and that varies massively across the world. And if you're in the middle of nowhere, then yeah, you'll use satellite to get you the best option, as opposed to spending thousands and tens of thousands to dig a cable out to your farm in the middle of Australia. So it's matching. Once again, it goes back to supply and demand, right? As an industry, we try to deliver other things, whether it be software or services or devices, which has its own ecosystem. So it's an overlapping of lots of different ecosystems, which I think is why we struggle, right? Because to go to that point Rob made about the industrial automation side, industrialization, you go and talk to factory owners, and they say, well, I've invested in this factory. I've got loads of cables. Yes, I want a few robots. I'm not going to rip it all out and start again because the cost justification just isn't there. So I think we're always looking for the perfect solution when it comes to telecom. And there is no perfect solution because there's legacy and there's competitive solution, and perhaps we don't need to be online all the time. So I do think as an industry, we suffer from delusion, that we are the most important element in the mix. And of course, the most important element, if from a business point of view, is making money. And from a consumer point of view, it is about being connected. I'm going to slightly contradict myself.
I think the other thing that's the most important thing for any business is a customer, right? And this industry is technology focused, not customer focused. I don't care. No one will, get on an earnings call and say that. But let's face it. I mean, it is technology centric, and then let's find the application of that technology later. And it's come from that, from a licensing and regulatory environment sort of drives some of that behavior. But I
True.
think, it shouldn't be one size fits all, right? With like the connectivity type or anything else. It should be a mix of, in that example you used, Chris, it's just in a factory environment. There's not one bearer type, for example, that works for everything. In this corner, you might have Wi-Fi. In that corner, you might, use LoRa, or over here, you might use 5G or 4G or whatever you want to use. Some places that might be wired Ethernet. It's just looking at the solution you're trying to solve and finding that best solution that comes with many different bits and pieces, getting away from, I think there's a real religion around bearer type in this industry, which is, it's a little bit ridiculous.
Yeah.
Although when you pay a lot of money for a certain amount of spectrum, you want to push stuff down it. But it's about finding a solution for customers that involves multiple enablers and multiple bearer types.
So, Rob, Charles, you may remember the guy who was group CIO at Telefonica, a guy called Phil Jordan, and he joined me on the Great Telco Debate 18 months ago now. And he spent 5 years working at Sainsbury's, the UK supermarket chain with other businesses. And I wanted him to talk about telecoms, having been away from it for 5 years. And he said a couple of things he said, which is very relevant to this conversation. He said, first of all, he said, I hate to tell you this, we don't wake up worrying about connectivity all the time. We worry about how much Charles is going to spend when he goes into the supermarket, or what he's going to buy, right? And we analyze it because we make 1% margin, not 20, 30% margin. And he said the other thing, which is really important, he said for telcos, customers are an abstract concept. What you just said, Rob. We used to connect not even people, because we put a phone on the hallway in our parents' home, and gradually we've extended that throughout the home. We used to connect buildings, and now we go right down to the desk, or we're connecting all the items in the IoT roster that you talked about. So actually, the change required, the mentality change required for the telecom industry is to really understand that end customer. And we don't.
I'll give you a great example of this. It's probably the best example I've seen about how we're still too tech focused and don't really understand customers. And it was during the 5G marketing campaign that Singtel ran. They ran a campaign about, when do you use 4G, 5G, or Wi-Fi 6 as a campaign?
You just lost every customer there.
Which
right?
customer, who is actually going to go, oh, I've always wondered that. It's my phone. Whatever my phone picks up is what I'm going to use. And the idea that they ran this as a campaign, I was thinking, who do they think their customers actually are? So that's the best example I've seen of the tech push where we just do not understand human outcomes and what needs to be delivered to the consumer or customers.
And I think it also comes back to that point about the dumb pipe, that the actual pipe delivered is relatively dumb. Complexity, the sophistication behind delivering the pipe is phenomenally complex. But that's the job of the telco to do that. Making it as simple as possible for you to consume it, or me to consume it, or Rob, whatever. That should be in fact, that's the marketing. I mean, I guess part of the challenge that you've just raised here is that we've never had to market. We've never had to really sell in the consumer world. Despite the level of service, people keep buying the stuff. They're tied in for 1 year, 2 year, 3 years, or whatever, as we've moved away from, a lot of the pay-as-you-go time market. So I think it's a real lesson for the industry about how it is seen, in the hierarchy of terrible service industry.
Chris made a great point about, the value add and sometimes the lack of value add. And even in your reference example, Charles, about, let's tell our customers about how to use Wi-Fi versus 4G, 5G. Part of the value add in that whole scenario is, as a service provider, we should be able to say to the customers, not saying which types of bearers do what things. We should be able to say, guess what, Mr. Customer, come with us. Don't worry, we got your back. We'll make sure that you're on the fastest connection at the best cost, and we'll take care of all that for you. And that's, on the grand scheme of things, of the complexity and the service offerings and the things that can be done for customers, that's pretty low down the scale. But just having that mindset of, rather than explaining the complexity, taking away the complexity. And there's that mindset shift that just has to come into the industry.
Well, I wish them luck to
Right.
get there because it's taken a long time. We keep waiting for this to happen. I kept, thinking that telcos are going to learn after this, but no, it keeps going on. But I want to switch tack a bit because we have mentioned IoT quite a bit. And Chris, when we were chatting before we jumped on the call, you had mentioned about, yeah, IoT used to have this really big hype numbers surrounding it. So I think it was Ericsson had said there was going to be 30 billion connections. And I think
50
Merrill
billion.
Lynch came out and said
50
70
billion.
billion. 50 billion. They started at 50, then they knocked it back to 30, and then there was 70 from Merrill. All these crazy things. I think now we're probably at like 15, and this is like 5 years past when they were supposed to hit these other numbers. So IoT hasn't really lived up to all the hype. In fact, nobody really asks about it anymore. What I like is I think it's just gone into more business as usual because it's gotten away from the marketing people and into the people who are actually deploying the solutions. But it is complex because any IoT solution, you've got a device that's going to connect over some type of a network through multiple different platforms to get to the application. You've got to store all the data. Then you've also got to manage this. You got to make sure it's all secured. I mean, it's complex. So telcos tried to branch out and do those different components, but they haven't really been that successful. So how are they going to be able to grab that piece of a pie? Because if I'm going to go out and deploy sensors in for water treatment system or in an industrial facility, I'm not going to go to a telco first. So what are your thoughts on that? And we'll start with Chris on this one.
I go back to my previous point about channel, that the channel expertise in, let's say, in the utility sector does not reside in the telecom industry. It's in systems integrators and other retail and channel partners who specialize in it. And it's also part of the OT part of the business anyway. It's the operational technology. It's not even not IT. It's certainly not connectivity. So I think partnering is an honest answer. And I come up with this question time and time again, and it gets raised. I was at the TM Forum event up in Copenhagen recently, and yet again, partnering came up as how can we be better partners in this ecosystem? And the fact that we're even asking to be better because we've been terrible partners in the past by trying to impose certain solutions on the customer. So by definition, it's an aggregation, it's an integration question. And it's also down to the individual countries, individual areas. So I think it's a channel play. It's as simple as that. And it's that dirty word in telecoms, which we've struggled with for many years, which is wholesale. That we should be wholesaling the services through partners, whether they're SIs or industrial automation specialists, making it easy. And in fact, even your old employer, Vodafone, actually moving that IoT bit out of the main Vodafone business group and looking for other investors just tells you that it just does not sit readily within the telco structure.
Rob, do you have any thoughts on this one?
Yeah, look, I mean, I really agree with Chris on this. I mean, it's a lot of times people are looking for the really sexy silver bullet solution, right? But just partnering better is a massive thing to this, right? And there's a lot of lessons that I think that telco can learn from outside telco, and that's one of the things. Chris, you mentioned experience from Sainsbury's, all groceries, online, e-commerce. These are like high volume, low margin business. They're great. They're great at being efficient because they have to, right? They're great at knowing the customers, mining the data, engaging with customers. There's so many lessons we can learn from that sort of industry. And, let's just for a brief moment. Yeah, I know I'm sort of breaking the whole thing about talking about telco. Let's not talk about telco for just 1 second. And you look at how economies evolve and you look at how, both companies or countries, as they evolve in their economic development cycle, they move up the value chain, right? And it's as simple as, you look, this is textbook stuff, right? You might start off mining metal out of the ground, and then you take that metal and you turn it into sheet metal, and you've added value to that metal that you mine out of the ground. And then you might take that sheet metal and, turn it into some silverware that you eat your food with. So you've added some value to that. And then you keep going and keep going. And then you might look at, you turn it into an electric vehicle, for example. Now, what you're not going to do as the person mining that metal out of the ground, you might be able to sort of get it into sheet metal or, shape it into some other things. If you want to get into the electric car business, you're going to have to partner, right? Because you're not going to be doing all the software, the tires, the wheels, every component of the battery and everything else. So it's about finding the things that you're good at, partnering for some of these things, and focusing on certain markets and moving up the value chain. That applies, I think, to any industry. And there's only so far you can go without that partnering. And I think there's a lot of great examples outside of telco doing that. But inside the industry, I don't think we can move up those, more complex things in the value chain without partnering. And there's a lot of examples that prove that.
But there's another point, Charles, which I think is really important to bring in here, which is that, the key elements, if you look at the investment money moving around the industry, noticed today that Vodafone have just sold another chunk of their Vantage towers, another billion or so worth brought back into the Vodafone group, obviously to try and fund other things they're doing. So that structural change where, the tower cos become more independent, you create these host neutral network, you create competitive fiber environment. There's a lot of underlying structural change going on. And in the middle of any country market, obviously you've got the former incumbent, building out there, building on top of what they had in the past. But that means there's also pressure changing, even at the basic connectivity level, changing the sort of sector structure, which is going to drive more and more competition. But that's where the banks have been looking. That's where the investment funds have been looking. Many fiber competitors have been put into the ground. Apart from where you've got a market, like Singapore, where it's been government driven and a more controlled environment. And I think that's really worth emphasizing when people are looking at this at a global level. You look at the Chinese market and what the Chinese government did 10 plus years ago when they said, right, mobile guys, you're reorganizing. You're going to be reorganizing into three main players. This is how we're going to drive that investment from an industrial perspective. And, and they've obviously pushed 5G much more aggressively than anywhere else has. Bizarrely, at the other extreme, you've got the US market, dear old capitalism, which has ended up with, because of the three strong players, equally pushing the 5G market, but making a lot more money out of it. And then the sort of regulatory quagmire in between in Europe, where actually we've got too many players and not enough freedom to invest and do what they think they should be doing. So I think there's a lot of structural challenges here from a business point of view, let alone what we're consuming at the end of the day as consumers and business.
Well, we've hit on the one big buzzword right now, so let's move on to the next one. What is the impact of artificial intelligence going to be on the telecoms industry? And I'm going to go to Rob first, because I know you're more on the bullish side. I know.
Yeah, look, I am more on the bullish side. I mean, there's part of me that has some skepticism about it because of underlying infrastructure foundation for AI is quite complex, right? And AI in some ways isn't new. It's an evolution of data science. And I think that data science piece isn't as mature as it should be. Again, we talked about the example of groceries and that sort of retail business. They're awesome at the data science piece. And they are, I think, better at, looking at AI to solve customer problems, solve business problems. So some of that needs to have a better foundation. I mean, telco industry always has this great data foundation and is blessed with this natural data about customers, usage, billing, where people are. They've got this rich data set that they don't use to its full capability. But when I think we look at generative AI, where is that going to have an impact? I look at, there's a lot of things that people will look at, with what's your latest chat GPT thing you can do and, cool videos and deep fakes and all that kind of stuff. But I think it comes down to in our industry, I think there's a lot of things around fraud prevention, proactive maintenance, customer service, network performance, and the AI ops side, managing both network and IT infrastructure. So I think those are the maybe less sexy use cases that I think are already starting to see some impact from AI. And actually, a lot of that's not being driven by the telcos. A lot of that's been driven by third-party vendors that are providing, AI ops solutions, that are providing fraud prevention solutions. And then I think if the industry can get there, there's a lot that they can do around sales and marketing, targeting, things that you would get from industries like online, e-commerce, groceries that are very good at targeting and driving stuff with customers. I'm not bullish on that, in the telecom sector. The other pieces that are more operational, and that are also being driven by suppliers and people in the ecosystem, I'm much more bullish on the impact and the benefits for the telco sector.
And now
But
for
I
the
think
bearish view, Chris.
no, no, not at all. No, now for the realistic view. And interestingly, I did my degree in computational linguistics 42 years ago. We did AI as part of that. We were trying to teach computers to translate from French to German, German to English, and so on. So I saw very early on what we might be able to do with the power of compute and the power of intelligence. I think we have to break it. And Rob, you're right. It's about data science. It's about thinking about what we can do through machine learning, especially in closed loop. So within the network, there's massive implications for how we take cost out of the network, it's basically pattern recognition. Let's be clear about it. So that by using pattern recognition, looking at what's going on, proactively maintaining it, the networks will become phenomenally efficient. They have to be, because what we're able to charge for the service just isn't going to keep going up. So I think there is what we used to call them expert systems. Remember that when they were called expert systems? So I think there is enormous potential for improving it. The problem with and Rob, you touched upon this, is the data set. We've never had a clean data set in the telco world. It's been so fragmented and spread across so many legacy systems where even departments within the same telco won't share data with other departments because they want to try and keep a handle on what's going on in that particular piece. We've got to break those silos down. And that is a long journey to get that data cleaned and into a place where it's accessible and manipulable and analyzable by the Gen AI system. I'm an absolute believer that Gen AI will give us that interface, that human to technology interface, which we've been lacking. And there was a great quote from the CIO at BT who said that Harmin Mehta, who said, for the first time, technology is talking our language, which is a lovely way of putting it, because before you had to be an engineer working down at whatever level within the scripts and so on. And actually the ability now to ask the network what's going on. Why did that network outage happen in Australia? Why did Microsoft fall apart last week? The ability to get a sensible and quick answer out of it, combining the human and the automation. There's enormous power in that. The bit where facing the customer, which I think will have the biggest impact. So the network and inside, that will drive efficiency. It will take cost out of the network, and it will give us the ability for people within those roles to do higher level things or remove them, right? Let's face it. We seem to be afraid of talking about getting rid of people within the industry. We have to. We're overstaffed in so many places. So I think perhaps we'll come back to that in a minute. But the facing the customer bit I'm really excited about this because, as you both know, I'm blind and have been for many years. I use so much assistive technology to allow me to do my job. Applying that sort of translation of technology between channels to allow someone who can't see to get an audio feed, someone who can't hear to get a visual feed, to give the service to an elderly person who's terrified of the technology interface that we keep forcing upon people. There's going to be a massive revolution in the way that we interact with the system as a customer. And by the way, if the telcos don't do it, other people will. And the other people who do it, they will tell you, Charles, you shouldn't be spending that much on it. You can get it for half that amount by going somewhere else, because that level of intelligence, that ability to interrogate is absolutely part of that Gen AI delivery mechanism. And you can interact on whatever level you want, whatever way you want. The next chat GPT 4.0, the Omni version, I've just seen an example by an app called Be My Eyes that I use. The ability to have an absolute, complete, chatty conversation with your AI agent is just phenomenal. So I'm not bearish on it. I'm bullish in what the technology can do. I'm bearish in the time frame when it will do it at a suitably efficient and high enough quality level. Because if we don't take bias out of the system as it exists today, we will just amplify the bias, and that amplifies mistakes. And we know there are mistakes and there are glitches in the data all over the place. So that's my concern. That's why I'm cautious about it. And in all the Gen AI companies I deal with, they keep talking to me about, we need at least 2 pairs of eyes on every cycle, because, and this is facing the customer particularly. Facing in towards the network, we might get away with less, but facing out towards the customer, we have to have the human element in there, to go back to the previous point.
It's still early days for a lot of it. I like the possibilities, but also I share a bit of pragmatism around this because I've seen us, we've had great opportunities in the past in a lot of different technologies, and we've never really lived up to it. So we've had has a history as an industry of not really living up to expectations. But anyway, it's at least it's exciting things. I mean, some of the things that you can do right now that you were just giving examples. My favorite one is actually from Telstra because it's so bloody simple. They basically have a one sentence summary whatever you call into customer service. It goes through your account and literally just produces a one sentence summary. And they've now deployed that to everybody who works in a retail store. And fine if you can do that with Telstra for customer service. But what if you could get a one sentence summary of a machine, like you said, or something's broken in your network? You can just ask a question on it, you get a one sentence summary. You're still going to have to go through all the same processes you would be before. You're just going to be able to do it much faster because you're like minimizing the time it takes to do these things.
But Charles, the challenge there is that, if you ask a Gen AI system, a large language model, a question, cannot reason, right? So despite all of the hype, it does not reason. It's just got a data set and it gives you the best option out of that data set. Now, until it can actually put into a hierarchy what the different levels of impact of the different factors in there, it may well summarize your account, but it may well miss something very important in that account. So we're still way too early on it. And I think the appeal of LLMs and helping us as individuals do jobs, summarizing stuff is great. I still personally write my stuff from scratch
Yep.
because I want my logical flow, if there's any logic left in there. I want my logical flow to come through and make sure I bring things in as and when I want. Because if a lot of the time you ask ChatGPT or Claude or whatever to summarize things for you, it doesn't come out the way you would have done it. There's an opportunity here, of course, which is that if you can deliver things in the tone and the brand language of Telstra or Telus or whatever, that cuts out a load of underlying work. And I think that's the appeal at the moment is takes a lot of the grunt work out as long as the basic data upon which this content is being created is kosher. So I think that's back to the data issue. If you haven't got the right data in the right place, you're going to end up shooting yourself in the.
And I'd be curious what you think about this. I got asked at an event recently, do you think that ChatGPT will wipe out the analyst industry? And my thought was like, actually, the mid-tier stuff, yeah, completely. But it also is going to take the people who are a little bit above the mid-tier but are really lazy, it'll pull them back down. But everyone's going to take the average of everything and produce average, average, average. And so for me, I think it's great because it makes it easier for me to stand out because I won't use it for those things. And I already pitch myself as hopefully, my content being above average, but this just pulls everybody else down and makes me even look better. So,
But also, you see, that happened. The internet did that already to an extent. So when some of us started working 40 years ago looking at this stuff, we were writing letters to people, sending faxes to people. Eventually, we were allowed to do emails to people. So you got very different data sets from very different analyst houses. Now, the analyst houses the data tends to be much more consistent. Look at the mobile phone market. You get pretty consistent data comes out of all the big companies analyzing the mobile phone market because the information is just so readily available via the internet. And my concern is that in some ways you're right. It makes it very bland. The base data set becomes very bland. The interpretation of the data becomes absolutely key, which is exactly what you're saying.
And I think it's a transformational technology, and it's not necessarily going to destroy an industry or wipe out different things. It's going to transform it, right? And it's going to shift that balance of power. And where I look at that, and I think, of course, looking at some of the work that we do as small business owners, like if we're working in an ecosystem against larger consultancies or larger analyst houses, the thing that it's going to take out for them is basically, the armies of people they have doing grunt work, bit of data here, bit of this there. That's in some ways kind of their intellectual property that is a bit, protecting their piece. I look at it as a tool that allows, from a smaller business, allows us to punch above our weights, to compete against people that have armies of people doing grunt work on the bench and actually do more value add. So the real value still comes from people on the top of that value chain. But what it does is allows you to compete against people that have, 50 analysts or junior analysts doing stuff. They can you can be far more effective against that. And that's where the redundancies will come from. But it will also shift and benefit smaller players in many industries. And I think that will drive innovation and benefit across the board.
And there's a really important point in there, which is that the the interpretation of the data, of course, is key. One of the things that the analyst community has done, as we all know from our past, is we slice and dice it down to smaller and smaller pieces. So you get information about the LoRa market, about the NB-IoT market, whereas actually what most analysts would never do is step back and go, okay, well, that should be put in the context of this factory is 7 years old and that this factory is doing that, or this company's going to build a new dark factory somewhere. And because we're looking at the pieces within a little pigeonhole of a market, and the fact you use the word convergence, Rob, which I'm very pleased you did, because it is another form of convergence. And all those little mice around the edge of the big telecom camel there, they are nibbling away because they're doing stuff, right? They're bringing their skills to it. They're bringing their scale to it. They're bringing their work practice to it. And it's breaking down a lot of the things that telcos used to do. And, you look at the fact that those hyperscalers have bigger global networks now than any telco. They're the global telcos now. They're the global providers, right? And in a big business environment, you've got telco delivering for a multinational corporation. What used to be nailed up, fantastically highly priced MPLS or private network, it's all done by SD-WAN now. So actually, it's in some ways what's happening outside of telco is even more important than what's happening inside telco, because the way solutions are going to be built for a business and for consumers as well is going to be driven not just by the technology of 5G, fiber, or satellite, by where an application is going to be hosted, whose application it is, how that is actually driven from a business model point of view, who's paying for it, whether Facebook is doing it free because you are the product, or whether you're paying Salesforce to do something. So the overlap and convergence, I think, between different industries absolutely has to be brought to bear on this. And I'm not sure, well, if you tell a ChatGPT to do it, they'll do it, of course. But I suspect in many cases that we analyze it down very blinkered about what's going on within one piece of the industry.
What I'd like to do is take a look at the future, and I'm going to mention 6G just because I think we should go into a real deep discussion. No, I hate when people talk about it, but let's just say whatever that next generation of network is going to be, which will be 6, because that's how we do things. We just add one every time. What would telcos have to change so that it would be more successful than we've been with 5G? Because everybody built up all the hype around 5G and it just fizzled. Nobody had any plan on how to actually make any money out of it. What would have to change within the telcos for them to make a success of it?
Yeah. So it's interesting, we're in that mode of, please, sir, can I have another G, please? So, actually, if we take a step back and look at some of the evolution in the industry, right? When we went into 2G, 3G, I mean, 2G was like barely going, GPRS was barely getting better than text, right? Or an SMS message, old WAP phones over GPRS. I mean, I'm going to date us all here because a lot of people don't even know what a WAP phone over GPRS is, but I mean, they were horrible.
I want to interrupt you real quick. If you
Yeah.
happen to need a presentation on the future of WAP and an evolving technology, I did it. I've actually saw it the other day. I've got it from the year 2000. I did it when I was at IXL based in London. And I was going through this and looking at my presentation on WAP and what's going to happen next with GPRS and these speeds, crazy stuff. Sorry for interrupting you there.
The coolest thing that ever happened with like WAP was the Nokia phone that was used in the Matrix movies, and Keanu Reeves like popping that thing out going, and then, that was the coolest thing the WAP ever did, but I'm not sure it was entirely WAP dependent. But yeah, we really needed those evolutionary steps for things to work. And even 3G, I mean, so at the time 3G came out, I was working at Cisco in the UK, and we helped build out this 3 network, which was, the first greenfield 3G piece, supposed to be revolutionary. I remember, all the hype around that. It's like, it's all about video calling, right? And hey, we're all selling this over IP video, high tech evolution of building a multimedia webcast, blah, blah, blah. at that time, a video call was horrendous. I remember using the NEC phones that they had as the first, video enabled phones, and it was a horrible experience. So, but it was a great vision to drive the industry forward and look at content and video and how people interact. And it wasn't until 4G that things actually kind of worked and had some bandwidth, and you could do more than just a couple of emails, and you could hotspot your phone, you could start doing things, right? And so the first, I think, up to 4G, we were just basically solving the connectivity problem, enabling some services. And again, it's more of an enablement than a real complex service development environment. Past that point of 4G, now we're getting into more and more bandwidth, which is like, okay, now what do you do with? And I think that's the real important thing is, and so this, going back to your original question, I know I diverged in a few things talking about, Neo and the Matrix and WAP phones, but 6G, I think, has a similar thing with 5G in that it's not necessarily about latency, connectivity, how many connections can you get? I mean, yes, there'll be some components of it, but it's about what can you do with it? What are the use cases? And it goes back to a lot of the themes that we've discussed. Again, I don't want to take the cop-out answer, go, oh, we've already given you the answer, which is, targeting certain segments, consumers, what verticals, businesses, what are the problems they have? How do you solve those problems? How do you partner to solve those problems? Because you can't do it all on your own as you move up that value chain, and actually delivering solutions for customers that solve meaningful problems. That's my 6G spiel.
So
That
I
has
think,
nothing to do with 6G.
so I'll give you a slightly different spin on it, which is that in the 6G labs that I've seen, the actual bearer connectivity from the cell site to the device is not the issue. The issue is about making sure we synchronize between all of the devices that go to provide the service in a household or in a business. So synchronization, and I'll give you a case study that was used in one of the labs I saw of a GP, so a regular doctor doing an appointment on a person in an old people's home via a haptic glove. And you put your head around that and go, actually, there's so many data points, there's so many different feeds, which we need to synchronize in order to get the value of that into the healthcare sector or the social care sector. I think the lesson to be learned from that is that it's not about the push out from the mobile network. It's about making sure it works with all the other things around us. And if you take a social care issue as an example, that that all the sensors around a person in a social care environment are actually synchronized. They feed back in. The right information goes to the right people, whether it's back to family or to carers or to the individual. And I think that, for me, it's thinking about that much bigger picture. It's not about the basic connectivity, because I think, as you said, Rob, we sort of nailed that with 4G for the mobile world. Where we've got fiber, it's nailed. We've got plenty of capacity. And we're just going to keep increasing that by the way that the vendors change that technical paradigm. So I don't think there's a problem with that side. I think the problem is, how do we manage all of those different pieces at the end of the network, if you like, whether it's in the home or in the factory or round about in society. And therefore it's got to be a combination of all the different technologies. So, and this is where the mobile industry keeps talking itself up way, way too high. And if you go to MWC, the GSMA, glitz and glamour, but actually the real work is not done at that level. We haven't seen a lot of glitz and glamour that delivers much for the last certainly 3 or 4 years. So I think accepting the relative position of telecoms and connectivity in the broader ecosystem is really important, and acknowledging that that Wi-Fi will do a job, as I think you said about the factory, Rob. Acknowledging that fiber will do a job. In some cases, copper might still do a job. Satellite will, but it's got to be contextual rather than just imposing this 6G is going to take over everything, because it won't. And I think, as an industry, we've got to be a lot more practical about the way things get implemented and how the business model rolls up, right? Because if not a lot of extra money is going to come into the industry, how are you going to fund another big step change in investment, another generational investment change? The answer is you can't. So it's got to be a much more gradual, and the fact that we're moving we're defined by software now means we can do it more gradually. So in some ways, we don't need a 6G standard. In some ways, we just need to build on what standards we've already got in place. So I don't believe there'll be a big step change. And I certainly don't believe there's a lot more revenue going to come into the market. But to go back to my previous point, but from a wholesale point of view, understanding how people want to use the connectivity, synchronizing that connectivity between all the different moving parts, that's where value will be created, because that's how, my mum will be looked after in her home via some sort of remote social care package, and be able to interact with everybody she wants to, with doctors, with people, and so on. So I think that there's a big pragmatic lesson in the same way that the supermarket story is about pragmatic, because they're only making 1 or 2%, so they've got to be on the ball. So, the question is, what does on the ball mean for a telco in the future?
That is the $1,000,000 question.
Right.
My worry is that a lot of them aren't on the ball. They're just sort of doing groupthink. And if you think about every single network equipment manufacturer and telco that I looked up use the exact same tagline for 5G, and that's that you can download a movie in seconds. And I've got a few issues with that. Number one, nobody downloads movies anymore. You stream everything, so it's kind of pointless. Number two, if you think about what they're trying to accomplish there, so you're trying to sell a value to somebody, but what's the real value? If you ever tried to do it, I mean, I don't know if you guys have tried to download a movie. So the only time I ever try to download movies right now are when I'm on a plane and I realize there's no seatback entertainment system, and I frantically go to my phone and try and download a movie. I could have 15 minutes. I've never gotten one whole movie downloaded yet while sitting there on 5G. Yeah, it basically works if you're the only person sitting at the bottom of the base station and there's nobody else within like a 1 kilometer. Then you might be able to do that. But I found that whole thing comical. So,
You
but
see,
what
Charles, you need to forget about looking at it. You just need to download the audio file with audio description, and then close your eyes, put your iPad on, and just listen through your ears.
I think what I just should be doing is traveling less in general. I think that'd be really the
Yeah.
best option right about now. I like this conversation because I think some of the points that came out that I really am happy to hear is it seems like the industry is getting a little bit more open towards collaborating, because like normal what happens is it's a zero sum game. If I give up anything, I'm losing and you're winning. And they don't realize that if we work and collaborate better together across the big tech vendors in different spaces, in different components of the ecosystem, we can actually drive it forward and everybody can be better off. So that would be a great step in the right direction. I think we also agree that there is still a lot of hype out there around things like IoT and AI, and telcos are going to be having a struggle to try and find their niche in there, but they got to do it quickly because, they got to make money. And if they don't make money on that, they're just going to charge us more high roaming rates, and that's not fun for us. So I think it's been an excellent conversation. We've covered a lot of topics. We didn't even get to all the topics. I was going to hit you on Open RAN, but I thought we'll just wait and see if that ever comes back again anyway.
Yeah. It's just
It,
an enabler, right? Same discussion, just an enabler. Got
well, it
to
does.
add some value for your customers, right?
It doesn't change the game, does it? Does Open RAN change the game in terms of that product? I think the key question to ask telcos is, what is the product you think you're selling to your customer? Does Open RAN change that? No, not at all. Does
Yeah.
it change your supplier ecosystem? Yeah, it might do, but it doesn't significantly move the needle in terms of making it a better product. I don't think anyway. I think one thing we haven't touched upon is the whole API issue. And, are there things that being a more open environment, more open API will allow some of that value to be extracted from the network? You mentioned identity early on, Rob.
Yep.
Does identity, the fact that I'm a blind customer, could they use that information to deliver me a better service? Absolutely, they could. Now that's if I identify as a blind person, by the way. But that if we're going to end up, and everything we've talked about here towards the customer really leads towards absolute personalization of service. Is the service being delivered to me the right one for me with my business and with my personal life? And we've never done that. I think that, as you said earlier, Charles, we just sell the same thing to everybody, and we oversell because your 250 gig it's ludicrous. We don't need it. So sell me what I need at a reasonable price. And I know I started with economics, but if you go back to Adam Smith's Wealth of Nations, the price equilibrium is when supply and demand end up in harmony and people pay a reasonable price for the service they're willing to consume. And I don't think we've ever been in that situation in the telecom industry.
Well, I'm not sure if we're going to get there the next couple of years either. So I think it's going to be a couple of challenges that goes ahead.
And that's the problem with AI, isn't it? And all these things that everyone says, it's going to change. Remember blockchain? Blockchain was going to change the world 5 years ago. And it gradually is changing the world. But and by the way, the other piece, which I think we haven't touched upon, which is really important here, is that with the AI that we're using now, and Gen AI especially, we have no idea what traffic levels that's going to generate. It may be if it goes back to the LLM, that's some massive data center, we've got problems in the network as we become more and more video and chat based. If it's more locally on the device or on the edge, so that's a whole new area that needs a lot of exploring, a lot of modeling.
Yeah. I mean, if you look at the explosive demand for compute power with AI, and that's what's driving, the explosion in the business in NVIDIA, right? Fantastic. Because for NVIDIA, they have this business model where the more AI that's consumed and the more compute power that's required, they basically just sell more stuff.
Yep.
In the telco industry, the more bandwidth that's consumed, it doesn't mean that they necessarily sell more stuff. Again, they have a different business model where you can have explosive demand for bandwidth and connectivity. They will not have that directly proportional increase in revenue that an NVIDIA
the
will
opposite
have on the compute side, right?
It's the opposite, isn't it?
Exactly. They're like, oh my
got
God, you've just completely caned our network and we didn't get any money out of it.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, but and I go back to my opening comment. Connectivity has never been in so much demand. We are right in center. Will it command a premium for that connectivity? Not the way we sell it at the moment, not the way we deliver it, and not if we harp on about another G coming down the line, but actually using the AI to actually deliver the service that is required by Rob or by Charles or by Chris. That's got to be the answer, and we should be able to do that with the data at our disposal and the services available.
But that's the thing. We should be able to do it, but will we? So,
hey, that's why we're not chief executive telco.
This is true. This is true. I don't think I could go back to a telco. But anyway, gentlemen, I want to thank you very much for your time this evening, or this afternoon for Chris, and this early morning for you, Rob. It's been a great chat discussing all the different things going on in the telco market. And we'll do this again in a few more months and see what else has been happening. And by then, I'm pretty sure once people listen to Chris's and Rob's advice, that the telco industry will sort itself out.
The only thing I'm certain of, Charles, is that we're going to have a lot more to talk about as we go forward. But thanks for having us today. It's been great to have this discussion with you guys and share some insights together.
Yeah, enjoyed it.
All
Go
right.
forth and flourish. Yeah.
Excellent. Thanks again, guys.